Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, and we should end. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out today. We have a very exciting program for you, and I'm going to tell you about it in 1 second after I get my notes. How many people like me overslept and consequently do things like leave their notes in their bag and forget everything else? But I'm very well rested. I'm also Diane Winston, and I'm a professor here at USC Annenberg, and I want to welcome you to our event on the founding myth and white Christian nationalism. I want to give a shout out to our co-sponsors, who are the Secular Student Fellowship, Progressive Christians, USC Progressive Christians, USC Interfaith Council, and the USC Office of Religious and Spiritual Life. Thank you for making this evening possible. So, among the many things we have to worry about here in the United States today is the rising sentiments of white nationalism, which often break out into racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and other kinds of hate speech. And so shedding some light on this subject is an important topic for all of us. That's why I want to welcome Andrew Seidel, who is a constitutional and civil rights attorney, an activist, an author, and a former Grand Canyon tour guide, and a sometimes photographer. Sounds like he would be at home in Annenberg. He's written a book on this topic, and after he speaks to us, he will be selling his book over there. And I urge you, if you're interested, to go get a copy of the book, which can be signed by the author. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. Do we have a government of the people, for the people, and by the people? Or is ours a government of the Christians, for the Christians, and by the Christians? That's one of the big fights that we have in this country right now. America is in a desperate fight against Christian nationalism, which is an existential threat to our republic. That is why I wrote The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, because I wanted to fight back against that exclusionary political ideology. Now, the goal of Christian nationalism is fundamentally exclusionary. It's to make it so that to be a Christian is to be an American, and to be an American is to be a Christian. They are working to redefine our national identity in light of their religion. And once they've done that, they're going to rewrite the law accordingly so that Christians will actually be a favored, privileged class, and everybody else will be second-class citizens. And you're seeing that happening today. Christian nationalism isn't new, but Donald Trump tapped into this undercurrent of Christian nationalism in a way that we had not seen in many decades in this country, at least 70 years probably. The best indicator of a Trump voter in the 2016 election was not race, it was not their religion, despite how much you've heard about white evangelicals supporting Trump. It was actually believing that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Right? If somebody believed that, that was the best indicator that they were going to be a Trump voter. So he tapped into this vein, this undercurrent of Christian nationalism, and he wrote it into the most powerful office in the history of the world. Christian nationalism is more than just the idea that we are founded as a Christian nation. It's also the idea that we've strayed from that foundation, that we have gotten away from our godly roots, and that we need to return to those foundations. And Christian nationalists like Trump and Mike Pence and Betsy DeVos and his entire cabinet, they use that language of return to justify all manner of exclusionary, discriminatory, hateful, and sometimes downright evil public policies. The Muslim ban is an excellent example of Christian nationalism. Most people forget that not only did it ban immigration from Muslim-majority countries, it actually favored immigration for Christians from some of those countries. Another great example of Christian nationalism public policy is the child separation that we are seeing happening at our border here in the United States. Anybody remember how the administration justified that? They cited the Bible. The book of Romans chapter 13, is what Jeff Sessions used to justify ripping children away from their parents and putting them in cages. He learned to do that in the White House Bible study, which is a real thing. It's run by a guy named Ralph Drollinger, and Ralph Drollinger actually bragged to the media about how he will teach Trump's highest level people in the cabinet some theology, like Romans 13, and they will go out there and do it the same day. He bragged about how biddable Jeff Sessions in particular was. The opposition to LGBTQ equality, the opposition to reproductive justice and women's rights, almost exclusively Christian nationalists, especially in their rhetoric. And then there are not just federal level pushes, but also state level pushes. Has anybody heard of Project Blitz? Couple of nods, couple of hands. Project Blitz is an actual handbook that the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, another group called Wall Builders, these are explicitly Christian nationalist groups, and they have developed a handbook of bills that state legislators around the country can pass, and it begins with things like putting "In God We Trust" up in public buildings. That would be a law they would pass. Putting "In God We Trust" displays up in public schools. Getting Bible classes taught in the public schools. So Project Blitz starts with these seemingly small, innocuous type bills, and then eventually builds up to codifying Christian privilege in the law, saying that Christians have a license to discriminate because they believe this particular religious belief. And it's not shy about it. You can go look the handbook up yourself. It exists. If you go to blitzwatch.org, this is a number of groups, including the Freedom from Religion Foundation, that have gotten together that are working to oppose Project Blitz and its bills. You can track all the different bills that are happening, and you can download copies of the handbooks as well. So, hopefully you're a little bit scared right now about what's happening, but there is good news. Not that kind of good news, different kind of good news. The entire Christian nationalist identity is based on a number of lies and myths. And it's lies and myths that you constantly hear repeated from Trump and his administration. It's things like, well, we are one nation under God, and in God we trust. That the Declaration of Independence references Jesus and the Christian God 4 separate times. That the founding fathers were all evangelical Christians, that they prayed at the Constitutional Convention, that George Washington knelt in the snow at Valley Forge and prayed. Trump just mentioned that at the National Prayer Breakfast a couple weeks ago. And my favorite, or least favorite, that all our laws are based on the 10 Commandments, that the American justice system is based on the 10 Commandments. All of these are wrong, but they are all integral to the Christian nationalist identity. And that means that their entire political and ideological reality is incredibly weak and vulnerable. It's a house of cards because it's based on all these lies and myths. So that is what I am trying to do in The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. I am trying to bury Christian nationalism. I'm trying to tear down that identity. It's a simple, if a lofty goal, to utterly destroy the Christian nationalist identity. Now, the book doesn't simply refute the idea that we're founded as a Christian nation, because I don't think that's enough. So instead, I asked a different question. I asked, did Judeo-Christian principles positively influence the founding of the United States of America? And the answer to that question is no, they didn't. And in fact, it's a good thing they didn't, because Christian principles, Judeo-Christian principles, whatever that term might mean, and especially those principles that are central to Christian nationalism, they're fundamentally opposed to American principles, to our founding values. There's such disagreement and at such a fundamental level that it is fair to say, albeit bluntly, that Christian nationalism is un-American. So that is the argument that I make in the founding myth. I also obviously happen to think it's the truth. Now, to make the argument, I broke the book up into 4 basic parts. So part 1, I talk about the founding fathers, because it's impossible to have this conversation without getting into the religion of the founding fathers. The argument that I make is that it doesn't really matter what they personally believed. That even if all of them were evangelical Christians, as we think of that today, which they definitely were not, you would still have to show that they used the principles of that religion to craft our government and our Constitution and our laws, and that can't be done. I talk a lot about the Declaration of Independence and the 4 references to the supposedly Christian God in that document, where all those came from, and our colonial history. So I think, how many people learned in high school that America was founded by people seeking religious liberty? Yeah, that's not really true. They were fleeing religious persecution, but that's not the same as seeking religious liberty. That myth, when people are talking about it, they're talking about the Puritans and the Pilgrims. They're talking about just Massachusetts, usually, not any of the other colonies or settlements that we had on the eastern seaboard. And does anybody know where they fled when they left England for the first time? Holland, where they had about as much religious freedom as you could possibly have at the time. They called it tolerance back then. It was the most liberal country, certainly in Europe, probably on earth at the time. And the fathers of this religion were looking around and saying, look, we're losing people. People are stopping, they're not coming to worship anymore. We got to do something about this. So they sought a new place that they could go and establish these little theocracies, which is what they did in Massachusetts. And it's one of the reasons that our founding fathers, 150 years later, looked back and said, we don't want to do what they did. We want to do it differently. They used those as a model of how not to build a nation and a country. So that's part 1. Part 2 is the United States versus the Bible. And here's where I dig into the principles of Christianity and compare them to America's founding principles. I look at things like the Golden Rule, the idea of governments, biblical governments. There's not a whiff of representative government anywhere in the Bible. It's all kings and theocracies. I also look at the idea of crime and punishment. I compare, for instance, the idea of hell to the 8th Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Seems to be a pretty substantial disconnect there to me. And then I get into even things like the idea of vicarious redemption through human sacrifice. Right? John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Right? That is one of the central tenets of Christianity, and I would argue that it's an abrogation of personal responsibility that's at odds with many of our systems, not just law and government, but financial systems as well. And then in part 3 is where the book began, actually. This started out as a law review article that just got really out of hand. And I was reading, when I was getting my Master's of Law, an opinion by a Supreme Court justice, and he basically said, yeah, of course American law and government were based on the 10 Commandments. That's a given. We know that for sure. And I thought, well, that's definitely not right. I'm going to write a law review article about that. And it ended up becoming this book. And so in the founding myth, I actually walk through every one of the 10 commandments and compare them to, for instance, our Bill of Rights. And all of them are fundamentally opposed to American principles. All of them, even the ones where you're thinking right now, well, what about that one? Because that seems like there's a pretty substantial, yes, even that one. You have to buy the book to find out why. But the first question we really have to ask if we're talking about the 10 commandments and which 10 commandments influenced American law and government is, well, which 10? Because in any given Bible, there are 4 different sets of 10 commandments. Exodus 20, Exodus 34, Deuteronomy 5, and Deuteronomy 27. And then the different religions interpret the commandments differently. Some say there's a prohibition on killing. Some say there's a prohibition on murder. Which is it? Because that's the difference between being able to protect yourself at night when somebody breaks into your house and not. What's the difference between prohibiting graven images and prohibiting idols? I don't really know. But Christendom had a war over this in the 8th and 9th centuries. They had a civil war over which interpretation was right. It's called the iconoclast controversy. So, which 10 is a question that is actually never answered when you're talking about which 10 commandments supposedly influenced the American founding. Now, after I go through the 10 commandments, I get to part 4, which is, it's the part that I'm a little bitter about having to write, if I'm honest with you. These arguments that I'm pushing back on, I think, are so bad that I didn't think I should have to write this section of the book, but I do. So part 4 is called American Verbiage, or Argument by Idiom. And these are things that you constantly hear. We are one nation under God. In God we trust. So help me God. God bless America. All of these different phrases that get trotted out to somehow prove that we're a Christian nation. None of them are from the founding era, incidentally. And all of them were imposed by Christian nationalists on us, on our country, during times of fear and national crisis. Deliberately, oftentimes. One time during the Civil War, another time during the Red Scare, Watergate in another instance. And it was done on purpose. And oftentimes, these new phrases wiped out earlier unifying messages with their exclusionary, exclusive message. So, I think probably you have not read a book like The Founding Myth. You know, previous books have offered this gentle correction to the Christian nationalist. They've said, you know, here's what history actually tells us. Here's what the founding fathers actually meant. And they kind of leave it at that. But correction is not enough. Facts are not enough anymore in the age of Trump. We need something more. So I do give you those facts and I give the corrections in this book, but then I go on the offensive. And I do that because patriotism has no religion. And I really wanted to make that clear in this book. I wanted to reclaim the idea of patriotism from these Christian nationalists, because patriotism has no religion. So this book is an assault on the Christian nationalist identity. Not only are they wrong, their ideas and their beliefs run counter to the values on which this nation was founded. They are fundamentally un-American. So that's the argument I make. Now, we're here at the Annenberg School, and I recognize that many journalists and probably professors are not going to want to point out that Christian nationalism is un-American or use such a loaded word, but they can still call out the lies of Christian nationalism. And right now, I think the media is failing at this. And I don't necessarily want to get into why, because I don't think I know the answer to that. But when Diane and I were emailing about setting this event up, she got me thinking about some of the ways that the media could improve on going after Christian nationalism. And first, I think the number one thing is you gotta educate yourselves about it, because this issue is absolutely crucial. I don't know how many stories I read about white evangelicals supporting Trump in the 2016 election. That was not the characteristic that indicated a Trump voter. It was actually being a Christian nationalist. Now there's a whole book out on just that topic, essentially, by Andrew Whitehead and his co-researchers. Anyway, I came up with 3 basic things I think that would help in the media coverage of this issue. And the first is that religion is not morality. And I think we all need to remember that. And the media tends to treat religious leaders as the arbiters of moral truth. And that is, in my mind, a big mistake and flaw. I don't think we need to be running to people like Jerry Falwell Jr., for instance, to know what is moral and what is not. The second thing is, right now there is an attempt going on to redefine religious liberty and religious freedom, to weaponize religious freedom, to turn the belief in God into a license to discriminate, for instance. And I really think we need to get back to the basics of religious liberty. It has never, ever been in the history of this country a license to violate the rights of another human being. And the best guarantee for true religious liberty has always been and will always be a secular government. There is no such thing as the freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. No such thing as the freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. That is a fundamental truth that we've known for a long time in this country. And the third thing that I would say is we've got to confront and refute the Christian nationalist lies. And they are lies. You know, the myths that I listed in the beginning about the Declaration of Independence and the Founding Fathers praying at the Constitutional Convention and Washington kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge, those have all been repeated constantly by Christian nationalists. In the front of this, in the introduction chapter of the book, I have a ton of examples of that. And I never heard any refutation from the media of any of these platitudes. I constantly hear that the country's founded on biblical principles, and that is reported, but not ever opposed or followed up on. I never heard a reporter say, oh, can you name a biblical principle on which this country was founded? You name one principle that's unique and original to Judeo-Christianity and which positively influenced the founding of the United States of America. I'd love to hear that question asked. I've asked that question quite a bit, and I've not heard a good answer, and that is not unique or original to Judeo-Christianity. At the National Prayer Breakfast, Trump likened himself to George Washington and likened himself to the Valley Forge winter and how piety pulled the group through. He did not get challenged on that. You know, there's this myth of George Washington praying in the snow at Valley Forge. It's been painted, it's appeared on stamps. There is a stained glass window in the US Capitol that shows this myth, and we know it's a myth. It was invented by a guy named Mason Locke Weems, who was a clergyman, a priest, parson, technically. He's the same guy who invented the myth about Washington chopping down the cherry tree and then not being able to tell a lie. We know it came from his book. It came from the 17th edition of his book, so it wasn't even the original. It was added much later. And nobody has ever corrected it. Nobody's asked about the actual history, and it always reminds me of this quote by Orwell that I included in the beginning of the book. From the totalitarian point of view, history is something to be created rather than learned. A totalitarian state is in effect a theocracy, and its ruling caste, in order to keep its position, has to be thought of as infallible. I think that really is where we are right now, and I think we can fight fascism with truth. And that's what I'm trying to do in this book. And as we near the tipping point in America at which Christianity's power and privilege are reduced to equality, those myths are going to be trumpeted with renewed volume and renewed vigor. And I think it's up to all of us, not just journalists and the media, every citizen, to oppose them. James Madison wrote that it is the first duty of citizens. The first duty of citizens is constant vigilance, right? Outspoken resistance, he said. And I think we all need to take that to heart, that it is a duty that we have. We are responsible for this. I think Christian nationalists have convinced too many Americans to buy into their myths and to spurn our true national heritage. America invented the separation of state and church. That is an American original. It's one of the few things that were truly unique about our country at the time it was founded. The idea was floating around in the Enlightenment, but it was first implemented in the American experiment. And that is something that I think we can all be proud of and we should all fight for. This is not a Christian nation. Our Constitution does not belong to the Christian nationalists. It belongs to we the people, and I want to make sure that we take it back. Thank you. So I want to do questions for as long as we're able to. Ryan's going to be walking around with the microphone. If you've got a personal story you'd love to tell, I would love to hear it. But let's save those for afterwards and leave this for just questions.
So I just wanted to kick us off in the Q&A with a quick question, an observation, which is that co-sponsoring this event are 3 organizations with either religion, spirituality, or Christian in the title. So there've got to be scores and thousands of Christians who are also concerned about this issue. Do you see that in your research? And what other religious organizations are really fighting this in the way that you're concerned about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so first, I'll say that a lot of the country is waking up to the danger of Christian nationalism. Right after Trump took office, Morning Consult did a poll, and they found that 48% of the country viewed Christian nationalism as a threat. Okay? So obviously, 48% is half the country. That's a huge number of believers, probably from all different walks of life. Morning Consult's going to run that poll again this week or next week, I think. So we'll be able to see if that number's increased. Second, I asked Morning Consult, did you do a poll like this before the election? What were the numbers? They said no. Nobody knew that Christian nationalism is something we shouldn't be worried about. So I think everybody's kind of trying to play catch up a little bit here. But there are other groups out there that are doing this. On the Blitzwatch website, which I mentioned, is this explicitly Christian nationalist push. There are a number of faith partners. There's also a new group. My timeline's all messed up from being on the road and from being under the Trump news cycle. So I don't really know how long ago this was. But there's a group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And it was a very public denunciation of Christian nationalism. They signed a letter and some big names on that, and that list is still growing, I believe. And they're looking to do more work. The Poor People's Campaign just held a big weekend seminar in New York City, and I think it was called "Taking Back Our Bible," something with that as at least the sentiment behind it, trying to say that Christian nationalism is not essentially, I guess, true Christianity, which is not a fight that I would want to get into, but I'm glad to see that it's happening. So yes, it is. There are other people that are starting to oppose this as well, not just fervent, godless atheists like me.
Okay. Hi, my name is Max, PhD student here at Annenberg. I'm curious how you said that you're looking to undo the Christian nationalist identity. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, how would you identify a Christian nationalist for one? And I'm also interested in, you mentioned media. Where are you seeing Christian nationalist representations in the media, aside from, say, like Robert Jeffress on Fox News as the most like par excellence example? But in studying this, I haven't been able to find like any concentrated places in the media where there's this perpetuated Christian nationalist mythology.
Yeah, I don't think the media is necessarily perpetuating it itself. What I'm suggesting is that I think we need to do a step more than that and actually actively point out when one of these Christian nationalist lies or myths is trotted out, and that's what I'm not seeing. Yes, Fox News is a hotbed of Christian nationalism. Lou Dobbs and Robert Jeffress get into this sort of fevered nightmare together and feed off each other, and it's terrible and disgusting to watch. I'll skip that sidebar. Your first question about defining a Christian nationalist. So there are certainly different ways to define it. And so Taking America Back for God is the new book by Andrew Whitehead, who's sort of one of the leading researchers on this, and he's got a more clinical or scholarly definition, I would say, than what I would define a Christian nationalist as. I would define it as somebody who is using the power of the government, the power of we the people, to promote Christianity. So using the machinery of the state to impose the Christian religion on other people. And I come to that from sort of the constitutional law perspective versus the sociology perspective that he comes to it from. So I wouldn't draw some of the dividing lines that they do. And then they kind of break people up into, they say that really everybody's on a spectrum of Christian nationalism on 4 different ways. And, I'm out there just trying to oppose it full-throated as much as possible. But I'm happy to chat more too later on if you want to do that, yeah.
So my name's Rich Procida. I'm an alumni from the Annenberg School of Communications. I'm now a lawyer. I actually have a small textbook on foreign comparative constitutional law.
Oh, very interesting.
So I'm concerned about the use and the placement of these 2 words, 2 hated words on the left together. I think there's a reason.
Do you mean Christian nationalism?
Christian nationalism, yes. I'm concerned about the spread of propaganda in this election that's designed to divide people and cause Trump to win the election. The reason you're not really finding that site is because Christian nationalism is not the threat you're making it out to be,
Okay.
and it's not new, okay?
Well, to be clear, it is not new, and I didn't say that. There have been waves of Christian nationalism throughout American history. There's one right before the Civil War, which is incidentally why we have In God We Trust on our money. There's one in the 1950s. There have been waves throughout the history with a steady undercurrent. My goal is to relegate it back to the fringes from whence it came. And I think, given the outline that I gave at the beginning, Project Blitz, which explicitly says that it's trying to create a Christian nation, the Muslim ban, the child separation policy at the border being based on the Bible. I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest that Christian nationalism is not just a threat to our rights, but a threat to the American Republic. And I do believe it's an existential threat, and I make that argument in the introduction of the book, which I would encourage you to get a copy of so you can learn a little bit more about it.
So a lot of groups anybody can bring up a list of things and do a card stacking like propaganda to set up a straw man in which you can now shoot down. But the main thing, and what you said about self-government in the Bible is wrong. I mean, here he rescued the nation of Israel out of slavery. Jesus is dying at the hands of the Roman Empire to oppose Roman authoritarian rule.
So so I think just to,
There's got to be a question.
Let's get a question,
in the offering.
yeah.
Okay, so basically,
and I'll just mention that those are both addressed in the book.
okay, and so basically, I would prefer to say that Trumpism is a cult. And there's a guy out there named Steve Hassan who is talking about Trumpism as a cult rather than making this election about Christianity. This election is not about Christianity. And if we want it to be about Christianity, we talk about Christian nationalism. If we don't want it to be about Christianity, we talk about Trump. And I think it's more accurate to say that Trumpism is a cult than to describe anything Trump is doing as serious Christian nationalism.
So I guess to put to interpret that into a question, is what you're saying, is this about Christianity?
I mean, this is about Christian nationalism, which is distinct from Christianity.
Okay.
And again, I'm not the only one saying this. I was one of the earlier people with a book out on the topic, but there are many Christian leaders who agree with me that Christian nationalism is a threat, not just to our country, but to the Christian religion also. And I think you have a much harder time talking about Trumpism as a cult than you do about identifying it as it is an identified sociological identity now, and pointing out that that is the central problem. And I think denying it because we don't like the association of Christianity with nationalism is to deny reality. And I'm not going to do that for the sake of other people's feelings. Christian nationalism is a threat, and we need to fight it.
What I find amazing is the number of people who actually believe you can have religious freedom without the separation of religion and government. And when you're talking to people that say, oh yes, you can, explain it, how is that possible? So I try to get the message at is that you cannot have religious freedom unless there is that separation.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And the way that I like to sum it up is there's no such thing as the freedom of religion without a government that's free from religion. And that has historically been true. It's one of the things that our founders sought to do at the beginning of this country, was establish religious freedom through a secular government. Daniel Carroll, who was one of only 3 Catholic representatives at the Constitutional Convention, said that the rights of conscience, which is one of the ways they referred to religious liberty, the rights of conscience will little bear the lightest touch of the governmental hand. And there are tons of examples of them saying things like this, that we have to keep government out of religion and religion out of government to have true religious liberty. And I lay out quite a few of them in the book as well.
Thank you. Rachel, I'm an alum. I want to know what your thoughts are on the effect Christian nationalism has on candidates from minority religions, such as Bernie Sanders. Do you think those types of candidates are downplaying their religion in order to sort of like not mess with that idea or not get threatened or anything?
I think so. I mean, I think there is essentially a voter-imposed auto-da-fe in this country where, people have come to expect expressions of religion from politicians, which is really interesting one of the reasons that I talk about George Washington not wanting to pray in the snow at Valley Forge, that also just cuts against everything that he personally stood for. He was very against showy public piety. Even when he went to church, he refused to take communion, for example. We've sort of gotten away from that and expect these public proclamations from politicians about God now. And I do think there is an element of that is working to appease the Christian nationalists, or at least cover from that. But I don't think you could ever, without getting too much into the politics of it, I don't think that a liberal or a progressive could ever win a Christian nationalist vote, because there is a strong element of politics and ideology baked in to Christian nationalism. It's the second part of that phrase as opposed to the first part of it. So I don't know that is ever going to win them any voters. It might just be a cover, yeah.
Okay. With the rise of Christian nationalism is linked to the rise of violence against minorities. It's pretty clear. I just came back from Europe, and I noticed over there's some similarities to what you're saying. I would think Christian nationalism is probably a problem in Poland. Mm-hmm. I was in London, and I could feel nationalism definitely on the rise, France, Hungary. So I think some of this, maybe not exactly Christian nationalism, is showing up all over the world. Maybe even Christian nationalism is a problem in parts of Europe, Brazil. Maybe you want to comment, not just here, but all over.
I mean, and I don't get into that too much in the book. I really focus on America, but you're absolutely right. We are seeing strains of it elsewhere. I think this is the distinctly American strain. The narrative and the identity are they draw so much on an attempt to draw so much on a rewritten version of American history that some of that would be hard to translate to other places. The unique thing about here is that because we were founded as a secular nation, because our Constitution is godless and guarantees no religious test for public office, it's a much harder argument to make factually and historically here. And yet, it has taken hold here in a way that is pretty striking. So that to me was the interesting thing, but I do think your observation is correct. Oh, over here.
Hi, yeah, thank you for this. This is awesome.
My pleasure.
Yeah, Jim Burklow, Senior Associate Dean of Religious Life and spiritual life here at USC. I'm also a progressive Christian pastor, UCC. So I resonate with everything you're saying. The one thing I would say is, just as a response here, is that you talk about how there's nothing in Christianity that's uniquely represented in the Constitution or the structure of this country. I think I would differ pretty strongly on that, not in a positive way, but in a negative way.
Oh, I would agree with that.
By that I mean, by negative, I mean Christianity and the Jewish faith are full of opposition to totalitarianism, right? Read 1 Samuel chapter 8, the prophet Samuel railing against the idea of Israel having a monarch, having a king. It's great. You could replace the word king with Trump, and it would be perfect. You know, in fact, I wrote something called Resistance Bible Study. You can look it up. And it's all about this stuff, about how the Bible's full of resistance to tyranny and monarchy, etc. But it doesn't have anything to say about democracy.
It doesn't, and the only governments that I've seen in the Bible were theocracies and monarchies.
Exactly. So, except early Israel, which was tribal and more or less egalitarian, which is why Samuel was against having a monarch. So, you know, do your homework.
Well, and the question that I posed is there a principle that's unique and original to Christianity? So, you know, you can't claim, for instance, the golden rule, because this is,
I think you're right.
Yeah, this is a universal human principle that every religion and society we know of has come up with. Reciprocal morality. It's pretty basic.
Right.
So, name a principle that's original and unique to Christianity that positively influenced the founding of the United States of America. And I think that's a really, really hard thing to do.
I think you're absolutely right, but I think there's the Judeo-Christian oppositional attitude towards tyranny is strong, and I think that did influence the founding.
We can point to
people of our
examples of
country.
this. So during the American Revolution,
Yeah.
there were preachers on both sides.
Yes,
so
you're right.
I mean, Robert Boucher, for instance, was this Anglican preacher in England who's citing Romans 13. Coming back to that, to say, yes, the colonies are absolutely wrong. They are rebelling against God's law. You point and tell me what law they are relying on to declare independence and rebel. And the law of nature and nature's God, which is what's referenced in the Declaration of Independence, that's atheism. That's heretical. And I mean, but there were people here in the States who were saying the exact opposite and saying, yes, we are living out God's law and doing this rebellion.
One question, I give this up, and that is, can you comment on Rushdoony?
I mean, yeah, so Rushdoony would be a perfect example of a Christian nationalist. I try not to get into the difference between dominionists and Seven Mountain dominionists and Reconstructionists, because I don't think those are useful phrases for the average person to hear. So I stick to Christian nationalism and Christian nationalist, because those are, I think, what people can understand even at a gut level without getting into it. But he and his whole, I don't even want to call it a school of thought, is right in line with Christian nationalism. So
I think Project Blitz is probably the most concrete example of Christian nationalism right now that is, affecting the states on a very tangible level for some communities. I'm curious, since the Wall Builders conference back in, I think it was November of last year, when they rebranded it as Freedom for All, if there's been any significant changes in strategy or responses to whatever new handbook has come out or whatever new strategies have been articulated.
Yeah, so Project Blitz, for people who don't know, that is not a term I made up for them. They chose that name with all the connotations that come with it deliberately, and it backfired pretty marvelously over the past few years, and we've formed this coalition, Blitzwatch, that is really doing a fantastic job of pushing back on it and defeating their bills. Their rate of success is dramatically lower than they thought it was going to be. So they rebranded as Freedom for All, and everybody's ignoring that and continuing to call them Project Blitz, which I think is correct and what we should do. And they're still not having that much success. There have been a huge wave of bills. So every election year, legislators tend to pass more and more crazy bills to get themselves into the news, to force their opponents to make choices on these things. And we're seeing a ton of legislation pop up this year, but it doesn't look like much of it is going to be successful. So their rebranding effort, I think, is going to fail. Yeah. Yeah, mostly tier one. So again, they have different tiers in the handbook. Tier one are sort of those ceremonial type bills, putting In God We Trust up in the public schools, things like that. And then the final tier, well, they actually have, well, yeah, the final tier is those laws that would allow Christians to discriminate on the basis of their particular belief in God against gay couples that want to adopt or gay couples that want a wedding cake, things like that. So it essentially, again, legalize discrimination and elevate Christians to this special favored class. And not to all Christians, Christians that happen to believe these certain things. So it's, I mean, it's a very, to me, it's a very scary, deliberate push that I've been excited to be a part of fighting against.
Hi, I'm Paul Fromer, retired faculty from the Marshall School. Could you talk a little more about what the spiritual and religious beliefs of the Founding Fathers actually were? Sure. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, for example, didn't Jefferson take his copy of the Bible and literally cut it up and throw parts of it away?
He did. So before I get into some of the more interesting beliefs of the Founding Fathers, the argument that I make in the book is that this is a fascinating conversation to have. And if you give me a glass of whiskey and 8 hours, I will never get off this stage. But it's really irrelevant to the question of whether or not we are a Christian nation or whether or not they based our government and our laws on Christianity in any way, shape, or form. What matters more there is their political ideas and their belief about the separation of state and church and things like that. And we also have to note that, you know, beliefs change throughout a lifetime, right? George Washington almost certainly didn't believe the same thing he did when he was 18 as when he was 58. I certainly am far different than I was when I was in college. And so you can pull different things from different parts of their life, from different audiences. For instance, if you were writing to a friend, like when Thomas Jefferson is writing to John Adams or vice versa, they're speaking very differently than if they're publishing a document or a treatise on government. And we tend to forget that nowadays, and the discussion turns into a quote war, with people pulling their favorite quotes out of context and just saying, here's what he said, so this means he's an atheist. Here's what he said, this means he's a devout Christian. Jefferson did take a razor to the Bible. He cut out all the supernatural aspects. Virgin birth, angels, resurrection, all of that. He likened it to pulling diamonds from a dung heap. That was his words, not mine. And actually, he cut out the parts that were not supernatural out of the Bible and then pasted them into another book in 4 different languages. The Smithsonian American History Museum used to have it on display. I don't know if they still do, but you can get a copy from the Smithsonian, and it's not, it's actually, they scanned the pages on these high-res pages, so it's original. It's really cool. So not really the act of a devout Christian, you would think. He was accused of being an atheist in his lifetime. George Washington he was dying for 3 days, actively shunned having any clergy at his deathbed, which I think is pretty suggestive. And you know, there are a number of great examples of this. My favorite example of sort of non-Christian behavior from the founders is Gouverneur Morris. He's the guy who actually wrote the words, "We the people." So he was on the committee for style for the Constitution, and so he gave the Constitution its final polish and the style behind the words. He was a peg leg. He lost his leg in a carriage accident, supposedly fleeing from a angry husband. That's probably apocryphal. John Jay, one of the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, another founding father, author of a couple of the Federalist Papers, said that he wished Jay had lost something else in that carriage accident. Gouverneur Morris famously had an affair with Talleyrand's mistress while he was our ambassador to France during the French Revolution. And there's this remarkable passages in his diary of the escapades that he and she got into, including in the carriage driving around Paris, in a nunnery that she used to attend, which hardly seems like something a devout Christian would do. But anyway, there's a lot of really interesting tidbits, and I include a lot of that in the book.
Yeah, Jeremy Banks, independent scholar. Just one question, and I guess people have talked about the Christian national aspect. I'm wondering about the un-American, which obviously brings up McCarthyism in a time when we're already polarizing. Do you see that having an effective improvement on the situation, or do you sort of relish the conflict
Yeah, it's a
that would come out of that?
question.
That's the first one. Second one, I wondered if you could touch on the de facto preference for Protestantism in American history and the role that that plays in claims for wall builders and other of these groups.
Yeah, I mean, the first question, using that word un-American, I was squeamish to do that at first, and I really thought hard about doing it because there is an inherent value judgment in that word. But yeah, I think that Christian nationalists have done way too good a job at redefining the American identity in terms of their religion. And that is one of the critical things that I wanted to push back against in this book, because I believe that patriotism has no religion. And I mean, even when I say that, I know that people get squeamish. Well, I don't want to be patriotic. I don't like the idea of being proud of my country. And I think that itself is because they've done such a good job of redefining what it means to be an American. So I really wanted to take that back and I wanted to fight them on a more emotional level in a way, right? Because a lot of the argument, or a lot of the facts that I use in the book have been out there before. What I wanted to do was have a better argument. So what I'm constantly trying to do in the book is to give us better arguments to push back against Christian nationalism. And one of those is by punching them in the gut, saying, yes, this is fundamentally un-American. And it is, it's not for everybody, I recognize that. But I think it's worth doing because it really does wake them up. And I mean, I've been having this fight for 10 years at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I mean, this is what we do. We get 4,000 to 5,000 state church complaints every year. Half of those involve the public schools. And a lot of the time, we are hearing from people back from, so for instance, I dealt with a teacher a couple months ago who was telling kids that they had to pray before they go down to first grade kids, they had to pray before they go down to lunch. Okay? That's wildly out of bounds. It's been out of bounds for a very long time. And we get letters back from school districts before we sue them. We try to resolve this with a letter. And they'll say things like, no, this is a Christian nation. That teacher has a right, a First Amendment free exercise right. They're allowed to do that. And we have these arguments for a living in a way. So I've really, I think, honed new arguments for it. The second question about Protestantism and the sort of it being the de facto religion, I got into this a little bit in the book. And it's really interesting because a lot of our history was written by Northeastern scholars. Right? So the idea that we had all these settlers fleeing religious persecution or seeking religious liberty, and we're only talking about the 2 colonies in Massachusetts is the same sort of thing. You know, it's a result of the fact that the historians working on this were all from that area, so that's what they focused on. They ignored St. Augustine in Virginia and Georgia and things like that. I do think that is built into a lot of the history that people have read throughout our country. But there are also, I mean, there have been a lot of Protestants in America throughout, so it's not necessarily one or the other, I think, of those. It's a sort of symbiotic relationship there. Hi.
Hi. So you mentioned how Christian nationalism has occurred in surges throughout history, like right before the Civil War and such. I think my question is, do you think that this current surge is unprecedented? And if so, what do you think are the factors that lend itself to the extremity of this surge other than Trump? or in addition to Trump, I would say.
It's a very good question, and I don't know that I can sufficiently answer that. I don't know if this is worse than the other ones or not. I mean, the 1950s was a pretty terrifying time to live through. I tell the story about a reporter from the Cap Times, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, where the Freedom from Religion Foundation is based, so it's where I live. And this reporter put a number of statements from the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, other parts of the Constitution on a sheet of paper and tried to go out and collect signatures for people to say, I agree with these statements. And he asked 114 people and only one person would sign on because they were so terrified of appearing un-American or signing on to something that sounded so socialist or like it was Russian. You know, there was this McCarthyism fear was really seizing the country. I don't know that we're there yet. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if you can know without living through it. There's not a real way to measure public opinion back then. I mean, they certainly were able to seize on those times of national fear and crisis and impose Christian nationalism in a way that hadn't been done without it. So I think in a way, Christian nationalism relies on this division and strife to impose itself on everybody else. And it's doing a good job of that, so we know that is at least happening. But I don't know the answer to that now. Hi.
Hello, I'm Sarah. I'm a master's journalism student at Annenberg. You mentioned earlier that the media was failing at calling out Christian nationalism. And I'm wondering, looking forward, especially with the upcoming election, maybe you touch on this or answer this in your book, but what is it that you're asking of your reader or your audience in this case in terms of confronting and refuting? What does that ideally look like for you, or in terms of journalism as well?
I mean, in terms of journalism, I'd like to see, I mean, I guarantee you this rhetoric is gonna get ramped up as we near the election. I mean, Trump excelled at employing this rhetoric in 2015, 2016. It was impressive for, there were times where he was able to mention almost all of the myths that I mentioned at the beginning in one section of a speech. And ideally what I would like to see is the same sort of fact-checking that Daniel Dale is doing of Trump, doing it on those sections of the speech and not just it being reported that Trump talked about the Christian history of our nation and how George Washington prayed at Valley Forge, but actually getting into, no, that's not right. I don't expect journalists to say that Christian nationalism is un-American. I would recommend you don't do that. But I would like to see pushing back on those actual historical and factual errors and noting that it is Christian nationalism and that this rhetoric is typical of that. And there's a lot of, especially since 2016, there's a lot of literature out there to point to. And I would very much like to see us or the media stop confusing white evangelicals as a voting bloc with Christian nationalists and focus more on the Christian nationalist strain, because that is the better indicator. And there are white evangelicals who are not Christian nationalists. And again, I would direct you to Andrew Whitehead's research on that. But the other thing that would be really cool to see is Catherine Stewart, who's a journalist and a scholar. She's got a new book out called The Power Worshippers. And so Andrew Whitehead studies it, Taking Back America for God, studies sort of the sociological aspect of it. And Catherine Stewart, I guess the best way to say it would be she studies sort of the machinery of it. How all these different Christian nationalist groups interact and the wheels and the way they turn together and the way they feed off each other and things like that, and the who's who of Christian nationalists. She really kind of did some investigative reporting and got behind the scenes for a lot of it. And then I try to destroy it. So it's just, different takes on it.
So do you differentiate between Christian nationalists who appeared at Charlottesville and Christian nationalists who are in Trump's cabinet?
Are you asking, is that also a slightly white nationalist question?
Yeah, I mean, because those white nationalists would consider themselves, many of them are.
Yeah, I mean, the Venn diagram of Christian nationalism and white nationalism is pretty close to a circle. It's not a circle, but it's pretty close to a circle. And they are, I do believe that the Charlottesville, the not very fine people in Charlottesville were Christian nationalists and white nationalists. For whatever reason, they focus more on that white side. But I mean, Christian nationalism, there is a huge element, and I really try to get into this in the book, of us versus them baked into it and built into it. And they use Christianity to push that narrative. Whether you think that's true or not, they definitely do it.
But to follow up, you're differentiating between Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalists. Do you know of Christian nationalists who aren't white?
There are a couple, and I think Catherine Stewart actually has a couple of pages of this in her new book, but don't quote me on that. But I mean, yeah, the vast majority of them are also white nationalists too. Again, it's pretty close to a circle. I'm sure there are a few that you can point to that are not. No names coming to the top of my head though.
Oh, okay.
Samuel Whitehead? Oh, I was, okay.
Hi, my name is Dixie Matheson, and I'm a religious director here at USC.
Hi.
And hi. I think it's a big mistake to blame Christian nationalism for the problem at the border and for the Muslim ban, because I think that has to do with Trump's racism, which he's shown he dislikes anybody who's a different color than white. And he's said it in many different ways. And
I don't disagree with that, but the way they justified it explicitly was using Christian nationalism. And what we were just talking about in that previous question is there's a massive element of white nationalism and racism built in to Christian nationalism. And whether, as religious director, I'm sure you would disagree that that is your religion and that your Bible tells you that. They think differently. And they explicitly use the Bible to justify it. You can watch Jeff Sessions go out and do it on camera.
well, one reason that these Christian nationalists have become so strong is because Trump does whatever they want so he can get elected. That's all he cares about. He doesn't believe in what they believe in.
You don't think so?
Well, I don't think so. No way. No way. He shows it.
I'm agreeing with you for the record.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Trump. I don't think I would say Trump is an atheist because I think he believes that he is God. But,
yeah, that's true.
But no, I think he is absolutely doing this for political reason. But that to me is all the more reason that Christians across this country should be so pissed off about Christian nationalism and should be standing up to it, because he is using your religion and the rhetoric that comes along with it just for political gain, just to gain power. And he's done a remarkably good job at it.
He sure has. And I hate to see the name of Christian pulled down by this situation. I don't understand my brothers and sisters out there doing such a thing. It's totally understandable.
Yeah, I'm sure it's frustrating.
We are going, one of our sponsoring groups has a question, and then we're gonna call it a night. I can't speak for Andrew how long he's willing to stand around, but he is gonna sign books over at the table over here. You can buy a book, you can have him sign it. It isn't like some bookstores I've been to where you had to buy the book here, so you could have brought the book, right?
No,
if you already have it.
Somebody's taking care of it.
Okay, good. Yeah, so they're over there for sale, and so please stick by. And what's that? Are you motioning to me? Oh, okay. All right. So you can buy the book and have him sign it. One last question from. I'm also a religious director. Did you know that?
I did know that.
Here at USC, I'm an atheist religious director, a humanist, and this is our humanist student group who is co-sponsoring this event. So it's appropriate that she has the last question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Emily, just an undergraduate. I was just curious. It seems like there's been talk of both how to sort of tear down this ideology at the media level and also in a legal manner. But in terms of just like your average person who's trying to have a conversation about this, like for instance, just totally out of whack, if I talked to my dad about this, it would probably be difficult for me to bring just straight facts to the table. So how do you recommend having those conversations with people who are protective of things like Catholicism because it means a lot to them in their lives, and you know, approaching in a way where they'll be responsive?
I mean, I think you have to obviously do that very carefully with your family. I think it is definitely worth doing, and I think these conversations are worth having, and I think pointing out that actually we weren't founded as a Christian nation is really, that conversation is really worth having. And the thing that I've noticed, especially going around the country doing these talks, is that people have a wrong idea of how those conversations will go. If you sit down to have that talk with your dad, or you do it across the Thanksgiving dinner table, he is not going to change his mind right there. And that should not be your goal, right? Your goal should be to plant a seed and get him to question and get him to do. People have to change their minds on their own. And I mean, studies show that if you're just going to stand there and debate with somebody, they're going to actually get more entrenched into their idea. So you have to make it a gentle conversation, and you have to, I think, encourage them to go look for some of these things on their own, plant a seed of doubt. You know, there's a guy I know, Patrick Elliott, he was a student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he went to a debate there with the Freedom from Religion Foundation's co-president, Dan Barker, and this other guy, whose name is escaping me right now. And I think they were debating whether or not Jesus was a real historical person. And Patrick left that debate thinking Dan Barker just got his butt just kicked, just really lost that debate, absolutely destroyed. But it made him question one or two things, and he started doing some reading on his own. And then he eventually took a comparative religions class. And the more he learned and the more he read and the more he ended up changing his mind. And now he's the head litigation counsel at the Freedom from Religion Foundation doing this work. And he was convinced that Dan lost this debate, and now Dan's his boss. So it's really, I think you just have to sort of recalibrate your expectations on having these conversations. But I really do believe that having better facts and better arguments on our side can help us change those minds. I mean, I know it to be true because I've had those conversations. I've had people come up to me after reading the book at these talks and say, I didn't know so much of this. I didn't realize this and I am shocked. I was in Christian schools my whole life. I was in Christian colleges, and now all of a sudden I'm learning all this stuff, and I can't believe it. And they are changing their minds. So we can do it. It's just a question of not letting these myths and lies go by unchallenged.
Let's thank Andrew. Give him a round of applause. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Diane Winston and the Annenberg School for hosting, and all of our partner organizations here on the screen. Thank you so much for coming out. Stop by and say hi to Andrew and grab a book.
Thank you.